So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Future of Work event, focused on the factors we should all be considering in planning our roadmap for the coming weeks and months. My name's Robin Lindsay. I'm the Commercial Partnerships Director here at Damar, and I'm delighted to be hosting the discussion today. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we get started. We've got about an hour together, and we've planned the initial discussion over around 30 to 40 minutes. After which we can hopefully take some questions from the audience. We've muted microphones to cut out any background interference, so please do keep those on silent. But we have activated the Q&A function. So if you have any specific questions, feel free to raise those through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We can't promise to answer them all, but we will try and get through as many of those as we possibly can. So, as I say, welcome along to the first of a series of events that Damar will be hosting over the coming months, all centred on this big question: what does the future of work look like? This isn't a tomorrow's world future of work. Well, we'll be looking at holograms and artificial intelligence. This is about the very real challenges that businesses are facing and the challenges that they will face, and offering practical information, advice and guidance, hints, top tips, ideas and suggestions, all of which we hope give you some helpful food for thought for the journey ahead. And what better place to start a journey than with a roadmap, which brings us to our topic this afternoon. And when we first entered lockdown, the initial response from business was perhaps quite binary. A Forbes article at the time summed this up pretty well, I think. And they commented that whilst there were some businesses that were embracing the possibilities that new working practices might bring, others were simply tolerating it. And that's perhaps understandable, given that working from home was surprisingly uncommon. EU research shows that across Europe, only around 5% of people regularly worked at home before COVID-19. Of course, the other key factor is that we didn't really know what was to come. Few of us could have imagined in March 2020 that we'd still be subject to such restrictions over a year later. So fairly quickly, that initial kind of binary response settled into a much broader spectrum of approaches, the fabled new normal. Now, as we continue on our journey along the government's roadmap, we've seen the pubs and gyms start to reopen, hairdressers trying to rectify those homespun haircuts, and families getting to grips with juggling swimming lessons and football training again. But just as at the start of lockdown, the initial business response has been similarly binary. In recent weeks, we've heard Goldman Sachs say that they want everyone back in the office as soon as possible, whilst the Nationwide Building Society has told their staff to work anywhere. In reality, though, won't most businesses need to find their own place on the spectrum between these two extremes? And if we do, then don't we need our own individual roadmaps to help guide our people towards that destination? That's the question that I'm posing our panel of experts this afternoon. So without further delay, let's meet them. First, we have Hannah Beko. Hannah is a commercial property lawyer, as well as a coach and trainer to the legal profession, having founded her consultancy Authentically Speaking back in 2016. She's an expert in behavioural skills such as stress management, improving well-being, and success planning for life and business. So good afternoon, Hannah.
Hello, Robin. Thank you for that kind introduction. I always cringe a little bit when people say expert in, but it's nice when someone else says it.
Well, I've said it now, so yeah. That's done. Our second panel member is Liese Lord, founder of the Lightbulb Tree, a consultancy on a mission to help change the way of work for the better by creating high-performing, engaging, and well-being-centric cultures. Liese is a highly experienced coach and mentor and knows all there is to know about hybrid, remote, flexible, and agile approaches to work. So a suitably impressive introduction for you as well, Liese. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Robin. Thank you very much. I'm a bit like Hannah, an expert who's continually learning every day. Thank you.
And last but not least, Jonathan Bourne. Having started his career as a solicitor, Jonathan has been managing director here at Damar for 15 years. during which time he's overseen a tenfold growth in Damar's transition from a locally based to national provider of apprenticeship standards in business and professional services. He's worked with a whole host of employer and sector groups to design and tailor apprenticeship standards across a broad range of sectors. Good afternoon, Jonathan.
Thank you, Robin. And I'm delighted that you didn't call me an expert, because in flexible and remote working, I'm certainly not. However, I am working with our team at Damar and some of our employers to navigate that journey. So I'm very happy to share our experience thus far with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, to our main business of the afternoon, and I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay, Hannah, on the topic of phasing people's return to work. So, I'm sure many of the attendees this afternoon may have colleagues who are still furloughed or perhaps on reduced hours. Some may be working different patterns. We may have people seconded to other projects, and many will still be working from home. So in your view, what does a return to work actually look like?
Oh, goodness, that's the big question, isn't it? Well, it's going to look like so many different things. And that's why I love how you've said that, you know, today's session is going to help organisations to start thinking about having a roadmap, first of all, in case they hadn't, and what that might look like. Because I think return to work, even for every individual, is going to look so different. I mean, where I work, we've all worked remotely most of our careers. You know, I've done it for 9 years working from home, but I did still go into the office at least once a week, if not more, and had meetings in person and with colleagues and clients. And so there's from that extreme to the people who were in full time, you know, 9 to 5, 9 to 6 or whatever hours every day. So I think the return to work is going to be a very personal question for each individual. And I do think organisations who don't realise that do need to give some thought to that, because I think there is a danger, as I'm sure we'll cover in today's session, of having an umbrella approach without thinking that this is going to impact individuals. And I'm sure Liese would, would comment on that as well. So I think what a return to work looks like is going to be so individual for each organisation and all of the people in it. And it is going to be some form of shifting from working at home 100% of the time to probably a hybrid approach of the home and the work.
Interesting. So do you think in terms of that range of different needs that there might be, do you think kind of some mechanism to talk to people is kind of crucial in that?
I think it is. I was thinking about this morning, and I thought what I'm going to say is it's all about communication. I worked with, just so people can understand the context, I worked with a lot of people who were furloughed last year. So I had a furlough support group for lawyers, which turned out to be mainly junior lawyers. That was the people that were mainly furloughed. And we had a weekly support group for 3 or 4 months at the start last year of furlough until quite a lot of them went back. And what came out of that, and I'm sure will be similar for organisations who still have people furloughed now, or in the process of thinking about bringing them back, is that there seemed to be, of course, there was a sliding scale, but at the two extremes, there was people who were not communicated with at all. You know, they were at home, they were on furlough. And then there were others who, within obviously the confines of the furlough regulations, were communicated with. Perhaps they were invited to the odd team-related activity, or their line manager or somebody from HR, somebody kept in touch with them. And what was very clear is those that were communicated with felt safer and felt more valued, because when they went for a long time, and for some people it was months and months without any communication, of course then they start to worry that they're on the redundancy list, because I'm sure that's natural to feel like that, or I'm not as good as the other people that have been called back and I haven't. You know, so many emotions and things go through those people's minds. So I think we do have to be really aware, and the key thing, I think, in all of this roadmap, as I'm sure we'll talk about, is about communicating with people, because that's how we're going to make them feel safe and valued in the process.
And do you think, I suppose, the kind of crucial people in that process are going to be our leaders? and the people that are doing a lot of that communicating. Do you think that our leaders are kind of capable of these of the communication that's required, and do they themselves need some support?
I'm sure they do need some support. I mean, there's so much anecdotal evidence, isn't there, about how much leaders are trained, how much, they receive, because they might just be doing the job themselves one day on a Friday, and then Monday they've been promoted and they're in a leadership role. Obviously, that's a huge generalisation, and some organisations, I'm sure, are fantastic at it. So the people skills side of leadership is something everybody needs anyway, regardless of the fact that we're coming out of a global pandemic and a year that none of us have ever seen before. So those leaders are going to be dealing with their own emotional fallout of the last year. That they're going to have their own things going on about maybe their children getting back to their activities, or their families getting back to some sort of normal, etc. So they're going to have their own concerns going on. Plus, of course, they're going to want to be there to support their employees that are either, as we said, coming back from furlough or just, but I don't mean that is an easy thing, coming back into the office with all the fear that we can imagine, with the public transport, how many people are going to be in the office, what are the safety procedures like, how is the vaccine program going, all of those sorts of issues leaders are going to have to deal with. And so I think any support and training that the organizations can offer those leaders in what I would call it's sort of it's coaching skills for managing these people, because there is going to have to be so much listening and empathy and understanding, because again, I'm not an expert in this, but I do know what stress and worry does to people, and I can see that we're going to have a lot of post-traumatic stress type symptoms as we come out of this, that we may have been sitting on for a year. And I think as people start to move back into the office, we may start to see, things like, as I say, heightened stress, panic attacks. How many leaders, team leaders, etc., are equipped to deal with those sorts of things in their people?
Is this something, Liese, Jonathan, that you've seen? This kind of increased demand on our leaders and the things that, are there any kind of practical hints, tips that you might have in terms of how to sort of assist those leaders? I mean, I suppose in some ways it's almost like people are coming back from process that we have in place for people returning from maternity leave, or a long period off sick. Should we be looking at similar kinds of practices?
You want to go first, Jonathan?
I'll have a go. I was listening to leaders. I was thinking, oh crikey, how do I measure up in this? Having attempted to lead Damar through over the last year, I think one thing, and it's a personal thing that I found over the last year, running a business, being a leader can always be a slightly lonely place. It's particularly so, I think, at times of significant change or times of crisis, and if you don't have, as I am, a very supportive board of directors, linking in with other leaders who are running businesses of similar sizes and similar sectors is really valuable. I was on a call actually last week with a group of people running training providers talking about a particular bit of apprenticeship provision. And what was really refreshing, we were talking about some of the IT challenges that we faced over the last year. What was really refreshing and certainly comforting to me, and I hope to them, as we talked about the issues that we'd had, is the degree of similarity. So I think, if you're a leader, think about where you can find your own network. If you don't have that already within your business, board of directors, non-execs, are the other people that who are running businesses or in senior leadership positions, because almost certainly they will be going through similar challenges to you. So those professional networks, I think, are really important.
I completely agree with that. I think it's surrounding yourself with people that provoke you to think differently as a leader. You absolutely summed it up brilliantly in terms of leaders are trying to lead us through unprecedented change whilst adapting to that change at the moment. And normally in change management processes, we would take the leaders and managers through that first, even if it was only a short period ahead. so that they could guide their teams and people better. We haven't had that opportunity, but actually I think what happened last year gave us the opportunity to go through change together and adopt a more open mind, a growth mindset. You know, we literally made it work. There was a vulnerability that placed on leaders, and I think that made people feel a little uncomfortable. But actually, we also saw people more fully, and we had to develop a degree of empathy and compassion because the situation was impacting people so differently. Like bubbles flying across the sky, everybody was individually, you know, their own situation was so different. You couldn't, not only could you see inside their homes and see cats, dogs, children, and everything else, you started to get a feeling for how the pandemic was impacting each family separately. So I think coaching skills for leaders is an absolute, but also deepening their self-awareness and understanding their own beliefs about leadership. Some of the surveys are identifying about double the number of people who plan to be back in a workplace for their 100% of their time. Leaders, double that number of leaders expect to be back. And I think some of that's habit. Some of it's because we thought we were just doing this on a temporary basis, and some of it's because it's we don't know anything else. So and what we're doing now is working at home during a pandemic, not working at home. So I think there's a lot of learning there, and I think for those that are willing to embrace that, it could be transformational for their businesses.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think, Robin, you made a great point, and it's an analogy I use with people as well. It's, you know, when we're bringing people back, certainly from long-term furlough, but maybe in other situations as well, you know, do we think about these people as potentially how we would look after people coming back from maternity leave or long-term sick? You know, do we take in some of the, you know, we'll understand that they'll have reduced confidence, they need extra support. Do they come back on reduced hours for a period of time? Do they have keep in touch days first? Do they come in for one day a week or one, you know, few days a month to ease them in? You know, we've got some of these tools that we've used before or hopefully have been used, and can we pull some of those out and use them now?
Sorry, Robin.
That was after you, Lisa.
It's a really good point, Hannah, and actually a number of people I've been talking to, we've been adopting the return to work after long-term sickness approach, where we gradually build up, because I think the other thing that we've may not have anticipated is the extension of the pandemic exhaustion that people are feeling. So we haven't got much of a commute at the moment for those that aren't going back to a workplace. So just that whole process takes some adjusting to again. So, you know, every other day or half days and then gradually building up is the way that we would help people when they're returning from, you know, a long-term sickness absence, and I think could be something to explore for this.
Thank you. I think, as a few of you have touched on there, there can be very few, if any, businesses that haven't been impacted in one way or another by the pandemic. Some organisations, I guess, will be smaller now than they were a year ago. Many will be operating quite differently from how they operated a year ago. So maybe come across to you now, Jonathan, and as we start to look ahead, how do you see us retaining the great people that we've got? And if and when we need to sort of start thinking about this, how do we go about growing our team, and what do we need to consider there?
Well, I mean, hopefully most businesses have both of those challenges. And in a way, I think they're two sides of the same coin, retaining your talent and growing your team. I think, and I'll share a little bit of kind of where we're up to at Damar, but I suppose for me, the starting point is, I think, you touched on this right at the beginning, Robin, I think most people will expect employers now to acknowledge that old binary, the idea that working from the office or client's premises is generally a good thing and working from somewhere else is generally a bad thing, is out of date. And we've got now this golden opportunity to find ways of working that are better for businesses and better for people. And it's not one size fits all. And my feeling is quite strongly opposed to both Goldman Sachs and Nationwide on this. You know, we don't need to kind of recite all the pros and cons of home working versus office working. We've been through these at length over the last months, but, you know, less time commuting, that's good. More flexibility, possibly, that's good. More time with family, that's good. But at the same time, you know, it's hard to switch off from work if you're at home all the time. The kind of always on culture, Zoom culture, reduced social interaction, and there are lots more, as you know. But I think about our journey, and this links into to some of the work we're doing in apprenticeships. Really, I think there are three stages. I'm trying to sort of break it down in my head. The first thing is, what are the boundaries? Because I think if you think about every business and individual, there are some limits that the business itself imposes on the amount of flexibility one can have. You know, driven by your service, by your customers. You could take a kind of silly example in a way. In hospitality or care, for example, there's not much scope for flexible working. In our business, which is the delivery of apprenticeships, by law, really, coaching visits have to take place during normal working hours. So most of our delivery activity has to take place during the normal working day. Some work may have to be done in the office just because of the nature of that work, and also obviously if it's not safe for somebody to work at home because of their particular circumstances, they can't. So a starting point that I found quite useful is, right, what are the sort of flexibility parameters, the flexibility framework for your business? That's going to be defined by your service, your customers, and to some degree by individuals as well. And then next, coming back to those C words, communication, conversation, I think, and this is really the point that we're at now in our journey on our Damar roadmap, because it's not just about the job, it's about the individual. And this, we've got an opportunity to here, I think, to make work more people-centric than it's been before. So, you know, give an example, it might be that a job theoretically can be done from home, but actually people's lives aren't always hugely flexible. It might be that for that individual, actually, they like the boundaries that the commute gives them. They like the fact that it's able to, you know, divides up work life from home life. It might be that, you know, not having the dog barking in the background is a good thing. And actually they like to come into work, even though the work can be done from home. So that's the next thing. You know, first, framework. Second, there's good conversations and working out what's best for the individual, but within that business framework. And then finally, and this is a really interesting one for me in the context of apprenticeships, what knowledge, skills and behaviours are the new ways of working going to require? One thing that's really struck me over the last year is, I think pretty much everybody's job has changed to some degree. Our job descriptions might not have changed, but how we work and what we do for most people has changed quite significantly. Or, of course, lots of people have brand new jobs or will be moving into new jobs. So as an employer, thinking about where there are gaps and work to do in terms of knowledge, skills and behaviours. Managing colleagues remotely requires a whole bunch of different skills and is challenging compared to managing a group of people in the office. And, you know, we've seen, as you know, quite a lot more interest in, for example, management apprenticeships, where we've been embedding some of that stuff over the last few months. And I think we'll see more demand, and we are already seeing more demand from career changers. You know, somebody a little bit older who's maybe lost a job and is moving into, I don't know, a junior accountancy role, perhaps. So that's, I suppose, three things: work out the business and individual boundaries, then have the conversations, and then think about where those skills gaps are. And finally, and this is kind of a fourth thing, don't rush. It's tempting to think that everything needs to magically be in place on the 21st of June. I don't think it does. I think it's a journey. That sounds a bit cliche, but it will take us time to get to the sort of the spot on the spectrum of flexibility that's going to be right for each individual and each business. And we shouldn't rush to get there and have everything boxed off by the 21st of June or whenever the date is. I think it'll take longer than that.
And just to maybe sort of open this up to the rest of the panel, interesting listening to what you're saying there, Jonathan. And again, maybe this comes back to those leadership skills. And has the fact that kind of everybody has been kind of working from home, has that in some way, I suppose from a positive perspective, almost leveled the playing field for organizations in terms of, working conditions and sort of fringe benefits and things maybe aren't quite as, or haven't been quite as big a pull during lockdown because, we've all been kind of experiencing our own homes. Does that kind of put more emphasis on some of the core principles about, what's a good place to work? I'm not sure if Hannah, Liese, you've got any thoughts on that.
Liese, you go first.
So in terms of core principles, Jonathan really summed up the initial, the process that I've adopted for probably 11 or 12 years now, which is the first thing to do is to look at the role and where tasks can be undertaken. I think we've learned a lot of that through the enforced working from home during the pandemic. We've started to work out what's clunky and what could be done better in a workplace or in a location together. I'm going to be quite clever about that. And then we've also worked out what actually has been we've been much more productive about working away and even more productive allowing for the fact that we've had some version of craziness going on around us, or because people have had extremes. They've either been quite isolated and on their own, or they've had quite extreme situations of homeschooling or caring, or family members staying with them when they wouldn't normally. Grown-up children come back from university plus partners. It's been so different for so many different people, but generally there's been this noticeable increase in productivity. So that's been really fascinating. So I think we've been able to work out a little bit about what could work best where. My view is, to Jonathan's point, I don't think the June date is an end date. I think we have to ensure that our businesses can be fluid and respond to anything that's ahead, and we don't know what's ahead. So we need to be as responsive as we were, as swiftly as we were last year. That was incredible how we just flipped to working differently. And many companies have got split workforces, obviously. Taking furlough aside, they've got some that have to be in the workplace and some that haven't. So I think we've got this, we've got that situation as well. So keeping that open approach to continually learning about how we do things, almost like a trial or a pilot period, which is I've found really successful for introducing hybrid or agile ways of working. Just let's try it, see what it works, tweak it, try it again. Hannah.
Oh, thank you. There were two particular bits that I picked up in your question there, Robin. One was about, is it the great equalizer? Or that's how I heard it anyway. And then the other thing about, will sort of fringe benefits not matter as much when people are choosing whether to stay in an organisation or which organisation to go to. And I do think, taking the second point first, I do think people have had their eyes opened to some of their employers and organisations this year. I think, obviously, as I've said before, we've all gone through a year in our lives that we would never have imagined. And I think if they felt supported by their organisation, fantastic. But I think it's highlighted those people who didn't feel supported by their organisation, and have some of them have already left and are thinking about it. And I think that will be something that probably continues, and is important for organisations who are listening to this to think about. How are we what we got right or wrong or could have improved on in the past year, that's gone now. How do we make this process, you know, just as you know, as supportive as our people and our organisation as we can, because that is how we're going to, you know, stay attractive to people in the market. But then to go to the equaliser point, I don't know if it's slightly off topic, but, you know, I'm a woman, I'm a lawyer, I have 3 children. I know the gender difficulties that we have had in our profession and many others. And there is no equalisation as yet. You know, there'll be people screaming at me if I suggested that there was. You know, there's so many studies that show women have generally borne the brunt of the work throughout the pandemic with the childcare and doing their job as well. And I know that's been very difficult, but we've taken a huge step forward from where we were, in my opinion. You know, even just in our household, my husband has got far more involved than he has been in the last few years. And, you know, I personally expect that to continue as we move into whatever the future holds, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. And also I think from a you know, a women's career perspective, what we've shown can work is, as Liese said, you know, productivity has on the whole increased despite everything that's going on. Imagine when we do get back to a more sense of normal, when the children do have a bit more childcare, wraparound child friends or family and things more as they used to, productivity is only going to increase again. So I think that, you know, all the barriers that we've had in terms of, you know, hours that perhaps women could work and progression they could make in their career, maybe we're going to see some changes there, which would be good.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue into my next question, actually, and I'm going to hand across to Liese again here, because we've touched on this a little bit so far, but we've not really got to the kind of meat of this question, which is, do we all need to be rushing back to the office, or do we stay at home, or what is the balance that we should be looking for? Liese, how do you think we sort of strike that right balance if we're planning this on our roadmap? What should be the things we should think about?
I'm going to sound like a politician here, but there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. You know, absolutely there isn't. And I think this has always been this has always been a really interesting discussion that I've had before the pandemic and since, around, well, you know, is it 2 days in the workplace or 3 days at home? And you know, I think we have to find our own equilibrium. So again, this sort of trial and pilot approach works. We've still got social distancing requirements in workplaces, so that creates a limit on how many people can go to a location for most locations, for most organisations. So I think it's very much about, I encourage teams to adopt a team approach, so that you keep the connectivity with teams and you start to work out what does that team need, and then the individual within the team. I've spoken to lots of real estate people who are trying to, got this huge logistical planner going on about, you know, this team can come in here and this team can come in there, and that might work for some businesses. All of the surveys are indicating that people want choice. You know, they want that flexibility to be flexible, bizarrely. It's a little bit like the flexible working legislation is inflexible because you write it down in a fixed work pattern, but it is about flexibility. And I think it's about giving people purpose. You know, why are you going to get together to a location? What's the purpose? So you can see the benefits of that. And then it's also about, you know, the work that you're going to do, and making sure that you're in the right place at the right time doing the right thing. And that won't necessarily be set days. Some people will want set days for a variety of reasons. And I think there is potential. It does feel a bit mind-blowing. I always get that emoji with the brain blowing out of the top in my mind when I think about this. It feels overwhelming for people who are trying to coordinate this. But actually break it down into small steps, down to team level, and it can be achieved. I know that. And it can be achieved really, really well. And the organisations that had this style of work before the pandemic seamlessly have moved across to what we're doing now, totally seamlessly. So there's a lot out there to learn from.
Would Jonathan, Hannah, you agree with that, or anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Just I really like that idea of trial and taking it gently, because I think one thing that strikes me is we could end up, as you say, Liese, thinking that we're being flexible, but actually just being a different form of inflexibility than what we had before. And as people get used to working in new ways, their experience and their view on how they're working will change, and also their personal circumstances might change as well. And I think, you know, one hope I have is that, you know, people will get comfortable with the idea that, you know, the way that they're working this month, this year, you know, this time next year, their circumstances at home might be a little bit different. What they're doing at work might be a little bit different, and actually the employer and the colleague should sort of be able to move together within that framework, whatever the business's framework is, to model that works. But it is quite scary, you know, the idea of all of that freedom. And so I think starting with taking kind of baby steps and starting with quite clear boundaries and seeing how people get on and businesses get on is really important.
So obviously there's some practical considerations, you know, things like equipment, systems, actual, as you say, Liese, actual sort of space within an office, but also our kind of ways of working, and pick up on the point that you made about, you know, many people aren't necessarily sort of working in an agile way or flexible working. It is that they're just doing it at home during a pandemic. So are there sort of just as many considerations really in terms of the way that people are working, rather than just the practical things about, do I have sufficient desk space, the right kind of chair, you know, the right bandwidth on my Wi-Fi, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's I've always used a checklist before to make sure that Maslow's basic needs are met, hierarchy of needs, both in the workplace and in your own home. And I think so yes, there is, sorry, Robin, can you repeat the question? My brain's just gone completely.
That's what,
pandemic fatigue, I'm going to blame.
So it's back to the point really around working at home during a pandemic, and the fact that we've got the very practical considerations, but are there also some, you know, ways of working really that need to be adapted, just as people's homes need to be adapted sort of physically a little bit?
Yeah, totally there are. You mentioned right at the beginning about binary, and Jonathan very well picked up on the flexibility spectrum, the spectrum of flexibility. So we've been seeing, for those people that hadn't worked from home before, they've been used to working in an office or a workplace, and now they're working at home, and you know, there is this massive spectrum in between. So I think everybody's got to find their own norm, and it's about working through, what could that look like for me? What am I comfortable with? It is the trying the different things out. Working it through as a team, as I mentioned before, is quite helpful, because I think historically when people have thought about more flexible working, it's been something I've called the All About Me Club. And there's been a huge resistance in businesses to that. This is different. This is about how can we help people find what works well on an ongoing basis and moves with their flow of life. Again, Jonathan, that was a great point to add in. So it is about trialing it. It's about saying, okay, let me, if just writing it down, you know, what do I think would work well here? What do I think would work well at the office? What would work well somewhere else? Because I know a lot of teams at the moment that are meeting for walking meetings, or they're meeting in a central geographical location if they live in a similar area. They're thinking differently about how they can work together and collaborate together. There's a number of organisations that have moved out of their workspaces and are thinking differently about how they use workspaces and sourcing the right workspace for what they want to do, which I think is great. I mean, that gives you, so you're not really going to get bored with your workspace, are you, when you're moving around like that? And there's also organisations that are reforming the workspaces that they've got now so that they create different spaces in those locations for the different types of work they want people to do when they come to the office. So more collaborative spaces, more brainstorming spaces, more, you know, appealing meeting spaces, and then changing how we work to everything's being centralised around a virtual way of working rather than I can remember when I first introduced an agile way of working. You only had a meeting when you could get a meeting room, then you turn up and you'd be one of 2 out of 12 that was in a meeting room and everybody else is virtual. It's like, oh, I think the tail's wagging the dog here, you know, the property's wagging. It all just felt a bit wrong. But I think now what we've learned over the last year is we can do most things anywhere. But it's also thinking, brings me on to another point around the 2-tier workforce risk, because you will have some people who prefer to go or their roles need them to be in the workplace more, and making sure that you help everybody feel included, and you don't enable that 2-tier workforce to become a dominant part of the culture. It is possible. Everything just takes a bit more work. And Jonathan, when you were saying communication, that was my golden rule last year. Whatever you've been doing before, times it by 3 in terms of communication, because in the virtual world, people's senses are so overloaded, they need that input many more times to actually hear what you're saying.
Well, I'm going to sneak in on the back of that one final quick question before we just take a couple of questions from the floor, because we talk about communication there, and one of the big things that we've seen, obviously, during lockdown is the rise in the use of things like Microsoft Teams. I think during the first 3 weeks of lockdown, Microsoft saw an increase of over 2,000% in the use of Teams, but also there's a recent study that's found that around a third of employees are currently spending up to 5 hours a day in these virtual meetings. So getting that communication balance seems to me that's every bit as important as all the other things that we're trying to balance here. And just throw this open to the panel as a whole. What do we think, kind of the right balance to find is on that communication spectrum?
Robin, I'll have a go as a start. I mean, we've all fallen victim, I certainly have, to those days where you've done nothing other than Teams and Zoom, and after 5 or more than 5 hours a day, you're absolutely exhausted. And I think that's an area where we're all collectively going to have to work on our behaviours, and it's going to take some time. But things like we've set up some of our meeting structures at Damar, so it forces a quarter of an hour break between meetings. That's not the magic answer, but that's perhaps one little thing that you can do. I've enjoyed personally picking up the phone and just having an unscheduled conversation with a colleague, and not even always about work, because that's the kind of conversation that we used to have all of the time in an office environment, of course. And I think those conversations, personally, I think they're really important. Or even going for a walk around your house or into the garden with your headphones in, thinking of ways where you can replicate that little, wander around the office that you might have done, or if you're in a client's premises, the chit chat before and after the meeting, which is often where a lot of the value actually happens. But I certainly don't have all the answers, other than I think we're going to have to develop some new skills, some new habits, experiment with some new things, and mix it up a bit.
And before either Lisa or Hannah jump in on that one, just to sort of pick up, there's been a couple of questions from the floor, which I think link in quite well here, around this concept of presenteeism or e-presenteeism, and employees feeling like they they need to be online as much as they possibly can. What are your views on that, and kind of, you know, building sort of, as the question asks here, kind of, how do you look at kind of building trust when looking at a hybrid model, or I guess any other model? Not sure who wants to take that one.
I can go in that one if you like. Only I've been doing some research on this the last few months about how our junior staff can be sort of supervised and trained in a remote world, and it all comes down to the leadership. You know, the leadership do, and because we've seen a lot of this presenteeism, you know, and oh, if my team leader or my manager sends me an email at 8 o'clock, they know I'll have seen it, so I therefore need to deal with it, and we're getting the same thing at the weekend and things like that. And I think because we've had this situation, obviously, where people have had to work flexibly, that's what we've been talking about, you know, so sometimes the team leader might be working at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night because they couldn't work between 3 and 6. So it's fine that the team leader does that, but for you know, somebody else to be picking up their emails and feeling that they then have to respond, that's the problem that we have absolutely run into, and is a problem that we are going to have to adjust for when teams do go back, and if they are working flexibly, so that they're not working at the same pattern. Because what you can't have is somebody who works a different time pattern to somebody else sending emails and somebody else feeling they have to respond at that time. But again, it's communication. I know we don't want to overdo it, but it is going to have to communicate about how they deal with those things, and be clear that, you know, once I've done my 7 hours or 8 hours or whatever I'm supposed to do each day, I'm not going to be responding to emails at 8 o'clock. But that's harder for junior people to do that. It has to come from the leadership. The leadership have to say and mean that once you've done your hours, don't be logging in, don't be checking your emails, don't be responding.
I'm not sure if this links to that, and somebody else might want to jump in, but there's also a question here around moving towards a more inclusive and balanced approach to hybrid working. But what do you do if, picking up on your point, Hannah, if the leader isn't supportive of that approach and is kind of really only tolerating it? Does this again bring us back to that point around kind of not just leaders, but I guess people needing to be able to push back a little bit on some of these things?
Do you want me to jump in there?
It'd be great if you would, yeah.
So one of the things that's really important when creating hybrid agile ways of working is that you have a vision that the leadership has signed up to. So taking the time to talk leaders through, you know, what does this look like? And I think it will be our own version of a roadmap, because, you know, the vision is some way off, and so many people want to get to the final solution now, but actually we've just got to evolve it. But it's being willing to try something different and buy into that. It's like buying into a company strategy, isn't it? You have to have the goals, you have to have the direction. It's no different with this. Because if a leader doesn't buy into it, then the team will feel they can't do what they want to do, and it creates disengagement, lowers the motivation and productivity and all sorts of things. And when I've seen that happen in the past, the turnover in that team or the engagement scores drop, turnover increases. You see people vote with their feet and their keys and everything else, so you know when it's going to come through. But it's helping coach the managers through this change and giving them support to go into territory they're not very comfortable with. And that helps start build the trust. And going back to Hannah's point, having those boundaries is really important. You can have individual preferences and work patterns around the core, as it were. It's just understanding what they are, and that reduces that agile guilt, which is something people used to feel they were a slave to the communicator button. You know, if it was on green and I had to be at my laptop, and, you know, I couldn't possibly have a break of any sort. But actually you can. Your leader has to give you permission. You have to give yourself permission. You know, have a lunch break, go out, don't take the phone. You wouldn't, you know, if you were in the workplace, you'd go out and buy a sandwich or do whatever without even thinking about it. If you're in a meeting, you're not going to worry about the emails coming in. And that it's no different, but it's about giving yourself permission and creating those boundaries. And then something else I did share recently was use the tools you've got in the technology. So most email systems enable you to send the emails at a set time. So I had a boss who liked to empty his email box on a Sunday morning, and it took me a little while to say it's really quite annoying because I feel obliged to respond. So we showed him how to find the send at 7 o'clock on a Monday morning, and it just makes, it's not hanging over you like a 10-ton Acme cartoon weight anymore.
Thank you. We are still getting questions coming through, which is great. I'll remind you that there's the little Q&A button at the bottom if you want to add any others. I've got a slightly technical one, and we did say that we were looking to cover, really practical hints and tips as well. If you've got people working partly in the office and partly from home, are you obliged to provide desk, chair, equipment, etc. for working from home? We have some legal representation on the panel. I don't know if anybody wants to.
The approach that I've used before has been looking at, it's weighing up the pros and cons. So most organisations have provided equipment already, and you may as well just leave it there unless it was taken from the desk. I know that some people literally picked their kit up and went home with it. But the approach I've used before is looking at the estimated split of time. And if they're going to be spending a reasonable amount of time, I might get pinned down for a percentage on this if I'm not careful, then from a health and safety perspective and a well-being perspective, I think it's worth investing in that. Some people are giving allowances and telling people they can buy their own choice of equipment, 3 or 4 things from that amount of money. Happy to share separately how much different organisations are paying. But actually it's a small amount of money in the scheme of things. Even for smaller businesses, it's still very much a worthwhile investment.
Thanks, Lisa. And a nice little comment here, picking up on a previous question, saying that there was a CEO who added to her signature strip that a response was not required from the individual until their working hours commenced. And they found that was a really sort of positive step in reducing the guilt attached, as you say, Lisa, to people feeling, I need to get an answer to that straight away. Couple of questions that have come through. We've still got a little bit of time. Couple of questions that have come through around picking up on some of the things that we've talked about already, equipping leaders and managers to support individuals and teams. And there's a couple that are connected here. One that I'm going to pose to Jonathan specifically, and then maybe either Hannah or Liese, you'd want to pick up on this more broadly, but talks about providing support or the importance of leaders and managers having support to work with people at a distance. And the one that I'm going to just pose to Jonathan linked to that is, do managers of apprentices have to work in the office with the apprentice to provide that in-person support and contact?
Thanks, Robin. And apologies, you may have noticed I've got one of the disadvantages of working in the office at the moment.
Go to Jonathan first, Mr. Any other.
Just behind me. No, apprentices, supervisors or managers don't have to be working in the same office with them. And it's really then a case of making sure that the supervisor or the manager is able to provide adequate supervision, but the level of supervision is no greater particularly than for a non-apprentice, if you like. And that's where the training provider too has a role to play in terms of linking in regularly with the apprentice and then back with the manager. So with that apprenticeship running in the background and regular review meetings, the apprenticeship itself should help support that management and supervision process. But no, I would guess at the moment, probably certainly more than 50% of our apprentices at Damar don't have their manager with them in the office because their businesses are working flexibly.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to just try and sneak in one final question. So this person's asking, are we unlikely to be able to say that people have to come into the office until everyone has had a second vaccine? And that might make it autumn until we can have everyone back in. Any thoughts on that? Obviously would go against what Goldman Sachs have said recently, I guess. Does that vaccine play a role, do we think? Or is it really about being sensible?
Hannah might have seen this as well, actually. I'm seeing some people say they're not prepared to come back until they've had their vaccination even. Some organisations are okay with that, and others are saying they want people to come back on a gradual basis. So I think there's lots of different reactions to the guidance that's come out from government. I think from a well-being and being human perspective, the psychological safety impact is massive at the moment. So we might think we're creating a physically safe environment, but people aren't feeling psychologically safe. And I know, Hannah, you and I both speak with the same tongue on this. So I think from a, keeping people engaged and feeling safe and feeling connected, take it steady. And what do you think, Hannah?
Absolutely, I would echo that. I mean, I'm not an employment lawyer, I'm a property lawyer, but so I would, if there was an organisation thinking about that, I think the point Liese's made is right. If you've got somebody like we've talked about before who was off sick, for example, and you're bringing them back in, you would go and speak to your HR team, or you'd get legal advice about the best way to bring them in to avoid any issues. And I think this is that sort of situation, because if you start telling people to come in when, as Liese said, psychologically they are not ready and are not in a position to, then you're storing up a lot of trouble for the future potentially. So I personally would not think that sort of forcing anybody is going to work. It's not going to work out well, obviously, for the person or the organisation. So I would always say take some advice before doing that. But hopefully what we've talked about today has made people think that it's not, I was talking to somebody else about this last week. It's not about allowing, employees to be calling the shots and say, this is what I'm doing. It's not that. It's a collaboration with the communication that we've talked about, and making them feel engaged in the discussion. That's the thing. You might not go their way. They might not get what they would like in an ideal world, but at least they could feel involved and listened to. And included, and then when you do feedback to them what the process is going to be and what the initial period is going to look like, because I agree with Liese, it should not be a fixed one and done, it should be a process. But what's the first part of the process going to look like? But explaining it to them as to why you've come to that decision and what your thinking is around it. It's just about involving people and making them feel engaged.
Feels like we've kind of done a 360 on that throughout this discussion. We started with the importance of involving people, and that's where we finished as well, which is probably a good place for us to finish, looking at the time, and that is just about all we've got time for. So just want to say a very big thank you to our panel, to Hannah, Liese, Jonathan, for their fascinating insights. I think we've covered an awful lot of ground. And I do hope that you've all been able to take something from this afternoon and that you can feed back into your own organisations. I'm sure we'll be returning to some of the topics in more depth at one of our future sessions, so do make sure to join us again for those. And please do spread the word. We'd love to have input from as broad a cross-section of businesses as possible. So please do spread that word and join us for the future sessions. Once again, thank you for your time this afternoon, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.